Mary, ICRC is working also in Syria, but of course not limited to Syria, but is a global actor. So what is your take, what is your perspective on the analysis that John has presented?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here. It's difficult to follow Maria's comments from the field. I think we need to listen very carefully to particularly the last thing she said, which was about solidarity and the importance of connecting as humans and to the notion of humanity. Thank you for that comment. I was asked to speak a little bit about diversity and inclusion. So I just hope that my comments are not too conceptual, following Maria. But I think it's a very important part of the discussion we need to have today. I tried to think about what's new, what's different about the way the humanitarian sector and the ICRC as well are working on and thinking about diversity and inclusion. So I want to start with the obvious. We do need to be attentive to power shifts. I'm sure throughout the next 2 days we'll be talking a lot about power. We see it in the news every day. We watch global politics. But I think we see it also in industry, in the manufacturing industry, in the tech industry. I can often relate to the health sector, where the role of the patient in the face of the role of the doctor has clearly changed. We all know it and experience it. And then, of course, the issue of power shifts within the humanitarian sector. The shift is that the client or the user is often very well informed, very capable, wanting to participate in decision making and wanting to have choices. So that would apply with any user, any client, but let me now take us to the humanitarian sector. The ICRC itself we say it's in our DNA to be people-centric. That's the story we tell ourselves. That's the story we tell the world as well. I believe that we believe this, but it does not mean necessarily that we're always doing everything necessary to be as focused on the people that we're working with. ICRC was a latecomer to the whole discussion around accountability to affected populations. Latecomer in the sense of the formalization of a system, which I can speak more about. We now have that in place. Being a latecomer brought certain opportunities. One was that we were really able to build on the years of practice of others, and here I'd like to mention that we were very much influenced by CHS and what they've put out for our collective use. I think we were also able, it was an opportunity for us to think differently about gender and about gender mainstreaming and all the lessons there. So it was just 2 years ago that the ICRC actually put up a unit and designed a framework for accountability to affected populations. I can explain that system, but basically it involves a coherent system where data can be digested by the organization. But importantly, the data comes from self-assessments of our own people, but also surveys to all of our staff and gets at issues of PSEA. So what's different? What's different about this? Are we just doing like everyone else? A few things. When we started working on AAP, accountability to affected populations, I hope that language is familiar to everybody, we decided that the issues of diversity and inclusion needed to be integrated in the center of that conversation. So we have people who work on gender inclusion, disability inclusion. They're integrated within the work that we do on AAP. With regards to gender, ICRC doesn't necessarily use the standard Western language on gender. We're not very fluent. I speak for the organization here. But it doesn't mean that we don't think about and work from a gender perspective. I give an example. Working in detention, I would hear colleagues saying, well, you know, we looked at this situation and actually our biggest concern is about adolescent boys in detention. So we won't say like, oh, I did a gender analysis and then I determined that adolescent boy, but we will definitely realize that there are particular needs of people in these particular situations with a specific gender. So we examined existing practice, we looked at ours, we looked at others, and we basically decided that focusing only on gender could lead us to overlooking complexity. And so we've opted for, it was mentioned in the opening words, that we've opted for an intersectional approach where the diversity of all the different identities are factored into the way that we carry out our protection and assistance activities. Work in progress, I do admit. A third point on what's maybe new is that with all the perception studies coming out, we, and I think everybody in the humanitarian sector, started to have concerns about who is it that's invisible to us? Who is it that's not accessible? Who is silent? And indeed, where are our own blind spots? And we took a commitment to actively look at the issue of inclusion in our programming, but also the humanitarian sector has always said we need to access populations, and we decided to flip and look at accessibility. So looking at populations' own access to services, but also their access to us. Are we accessible? Are we reachable? Do people know why they would bother to reach us, etc.? And of course, we set ambitious objectives for ourselves around participation. The need for affected populations to participate in identifying their needs, identifying the problems that they're facing, designing solutions, but also implementation and evaluation. And I believe that this is probably the most challenging piece of the puzzle for us. It's the part I worry about the most. It's easy to say that, it's hard to do it. It's particularly hard to talk about co-design if you have security issues, problems of access, etc. The fourth point, linked to the last one about exclusion, was a real realization that there are not just diverse populations have diverse needs, but needs also evolve, and they evolve over time. They evolve also depending on what's happening. So the needs of the people in Kobani now changed in the last 7 days. So that needs to be taken into account as we plan. Needs are, it also depends on who you talk to and how you talk to people. And it was mentioned earlier, we realize that we really need to look at the emergence of new needs. And here I would mention the need for connectivity, the need for energy solutions, access to information, some of the less tangible notions of the need to belong, something that I think the humanitarian community needs to think a little bit more about this. And as was already said so beautifully, the need for access to education and continued education. So the ICRC looked at the changing, evolving needs, but also, and I think it's very important that we say this, we looked also at the diversity in terms of capacities. So the evolving capacities of affected populations. And here is where I think we can get into the real meat of the discussion around affected populations designing solutions. Just to be short, I'll say we opted for an idea that the affected person is herself or himself an expert of his or her own situation. Fifth, and I have only these 2 more points, fifth point in terms of what's new, the journey that we're on, it's viewed as a journey. GPPI, I think, is in the room and was a very crucial part of an evaluation that we did. I just highlight one element of that evaluation that I think is crucial. ICRC came out looking quite strong in terms of our capacity to do political analysis and conflict analysis. And we came out quite weak on our capacity to do socioeconomic, cultural analysis, but particularly to understand power. And I doubt that's only our case, but that came out very clearly as a weak area and one that we would need to work on. If we don't understand well the communities we work in, the power dynamics, the environment that we're working in, then how can we be sure that we're relevant, doing the right thing, but also that we're not doing harm? The last point, and I think it's an important one from an institutional point of view, it's about leadership. We at the ICRC decided to put people at the very center of all that we do. Our new institutional strategy has at its heart this notion of people-centrism. It's a 4-year strategy. It's for all levels of our organization. And we did something very interesting when we spoke about people. We spoke about our people, our staff, the people that work for this organization, the people that are on the ground. And we spoke about our programming and how to have more inclusive programming. And I think there's something magical if you're able to put those 2 elements together when you start talking about inclusion. So to summarize, just to say, we're on a path. I personally believe it's a path of deep cultural change for the ICRC, but I would hope also for the humanitarian sector. And perhaps it's easiest to talk about it in terms of clients, users, affected populations being the ones who determine the relevance of our work. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This is really interesting. I realize I haven't heard the term beneficiary used at all so far this morning, which I think tells us something. We're talking about users and clients, and it's really interesting to hear about the story of a very old organization like the ICRC, which of course for many years was closed and sort of worked according to its own doctrine and the experiences that the organization had made, and now opening up and being interested in the experience of others, and thereby being able to sort of do a bit of leapfrogging. You can actually use and respect what others have learned and build on those experiences. The need to design accountability mechanisms that are appropriate for context. The challenges of really making reality of co-design in very difficult and insecure situations and places, and then the need to really get your political and power analysis right to be able to not do harm, which is really what this is about, I think.